watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And today we'll be closing out our series Lo-Fi Sci-Fi by discussing 2004's Primer.
Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to read this, and you're going to listen. You're going to stay on the line, and you're not going to interrupt. You're not going to speak for any reason. Some of this you know. I'm going to start at the top of the page. Meticulous. Yes. Methodical. Educated. They were these things. Nothing extreme, like anyone they varied. There were days of mistakes, laziness, and infighting. And there were days, good days, when by anyone's judgment, they would have to be considered clever. No one would say that what they were doing was complicated. It wouldn't even be considered new, except for maybe in the geological sense. They took from their surroundings what was needed and made of it something more.
All right, so here we have Primer from 2004, directed by Shane Carruth, made on the minuscule budget of $7,000.
The lowest we'll be talking about.
Yep, and so Primer follows the story predominantly of two engineers, Aaron and Abe, who in their free time, along with a couple of friends, are working on a project, some type of science project. We don't entirely understand what it is at first, but we understand that it involves electromagnetic objects and putting them into this box that isn't entirely clear what it's doing, but they seem very excited about it.
Some sort of experiment with weight, I think the mass, lowering the mass of it or something like that.
Yeah, something very specific. Yeah. But as an unexpected side effect of this project, they discover that they're able to move objects through time. So once they make this discovery, the two of them decide to play the stock market by traveling back in time and making all kinds of money and riches and seeing what they can do with their lives. But of course, it goes horribly wrong and things go off the rails. That's a very simple summary. So once again, always on this show, spoiler alerts from the beginning. However, this is a film that I don't even know if you really can spoil.
It's hard to spoil, yeah.
Yeah, so the beauty of this film and the thing that makes it challenging is that once things start to go off the rails a little bit with the time travel, things get really, really confusing as the viewer. Which is kind of a challenge for me the first time I watched this through. I don't know about you, Mark, if you felt the same way. The first time I saw this movie, it just made no sense to me at all. And I'm not someone who always needs a movie to make sense, but this just got so confusing that I kind of checked out a little bit.
Well, I think all the jargon they use and the way they're, there's so many conversations going on in the film that it makes you want to understand what's going on.
Yeah, it was never dumbed down.
Right, exactly. And because I'm like you, I mean, plot to me is not always the most interesting aspect of a film or most important. But for this film, it does seem like they want you to pay extra attention to what is going on. Mm-hmm. You kind of just get that feeling. So it's like, and it kind of brings you into this world, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but it makes you want to be a part of what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's weird. A lot of because there are a lot of films and a lot of directors who will intentionally lose you a little bit because they want you to pay attention to the emotion. They want you to pay attention to the mood. This one seems to lose you a little bit, I think, because he actually wants you to pay more attention to the plot, which is a weird kind of backwards way of doing things. It can be a little bit difficult. Once again, this is made for only $7,000, so that may have been a little bit of an effect of the low budget, but I don't think so. I think...
Yeah. Well, we'll go more into. Sorry to cut you off there, but we'll go more into regarding the budget, the different means that they had, and the very clever ways they got around certain things, which has been a ongoing subject of this series. And you did a very good job of explaining the plot. I think you did a very simplified version, obviously. But even that much was way more than I knew when I first saw it. And even coming back to it, I guess I had seen it a few years ago. I actually don't remember exactly when, but coming back to it now for the show, I was like, all right, going to really get into this, gonna just have all my focus, gonna add a couple cups of coffee going, and I was just ready to sit down and just take it all in and just like, pay attention to the plot as much as I could, because I knew more, what I was getting myself into than the first time. Because the first time you see this film, at least for me, I didn't realize just how much is actually going on when you're watching it, because as we discussed briefly before we started recording, there's actually multiple timelines going on,
like six or seven of them,
right at the same time, and the film itself is a paradox. I mean, it's discussing paradoxes, paradise. I'm not sure.
Something, yeah.
Yeah, and it itself,
that's kind of a paradoxical word, because no matter how you say it, it's
really
going to sound really weird. But.
Exactly. And the film itself, is a paradox. So there's a lot going on. This film, it's hard to sum up. To me, I would say this film is essentially about two guys who discover time travel, and then they try futilely to contain it. They try to make it adhere to certain rules, which, because there are ethics and morals involved and money, simply does not work.
Yeah.
I think that's what it comes down to. It's trying to make something work that doesn't work, or that shouldn't work. It's something that shouldn't exist almost. I mean, that could be argued. Obviously, time travel, whether or not it does exist, or whatever. These two are, they're the two main characters that we follow are two. I believe they're lifelong friends, right? They've been friends for a long time.
It seems like they know each other particularly well.
Yeah, and they're two young professionals, entrepreneurs, idealistic, very smart, obviously, and but I think the film is about how their friendship kind of disintegrates, and it's actually kind of a tragic story when you think about it, especially with the way it ends. That where everything is kind of where it began with these fun conversations in the kitchen, during the holidays with your friends, talking about ideas and things that you could do, and then where it leads up with their friendship dissolving, and they kind of lose what they had with each other.
It's kind of a classic gold rush story, and what I mean by that is, two people discover gold, or in this case time travel, but they both have different ideas about what that discovery means, who will get to keep the riches, how they should deal with the riches, and they don't communicate with each other. And so much of this movie where it gets confusing, I think, is that we are actually kind of seeing it. There is a narrator who, once again, full spoilers, we find out at the end, is one of the multiple versions of the Aaron character, Aaron played by the director Shane Carruth. So we do have a narrator, but I think that the story, for the most part, is actually told in a kind of third-person omniscient way. And where it gets confusing is that we're seeing kind of what everyone is doing, but we're not exactly knowing when everything is happening, because the whole film takes place over about the course of a week, but because they're repeating events because of the time travel, there are no title cards or anything like that stating, here we're on Tuesday, here we're on Thursday. So things are happening out of order, and that can make it kind of confusing. But I think it also has a lot to do with, like, past where it gets confusing, and I think that the confusion is important because what the director Shane Carruth is doing is, by making the movie get confusing, he's showing us how confusing it's getting to these characters, because they've discovered something that they don't really understand, and this is basically just the testing phase. Anyone who's ever attempted to do anything with a new technique knows exactly how difficult it is the first few times you do it, and how you're just kind of treading water. So when you're dealing with something this complicated, of course it's going to be way more confusing than anyone, even these people who are really knowledgeable about it, could understand. So it kind of runs off the rails a little bit there. The moment for me in watching this movie the second time through, when it actually clicked, and I'm not saying I understand this movie in its entirety. I've watched a couple analysis videos, I've read about it. I'm still not entirely sure I get it. But there's one moment, I want to say somewhere around the halfway point, where Aaron is talking about this one other character whose name is escaping me, but he's never even shown in the film. Basically what's happened is this other character, who isn't shown, has stolen an idea for one of the inventions that Aaron and Abe created together, and Aaron says, "Man, I would just love to punch him square in the face." And Abe kind of has this moment where he looks at Aaron and realizes what Aaron is thinking or implying,
Mm-hmm.
which is that they could use time travel to punch him in his face, get it out of his system, and then reverse it. Which just shows how irresponsible these two could be because they are just these young
Yeah.
guys. But it also shows this idea of a lack of trust. Once you
Mm-hmm.
start to, not only on the part of Abe to Aaron, but also Aaron not trusting himself. Because
Mm-hmm.
when you say, "Oh, I would love to do this," and you know you have this time travel capability, you start to think, "Oh, what if I already have done this?" So,
Mm-hmm.
so it becomes this complicated thing where these characters not only have to stop trusting the people around them a little bit, but they also have to say, what am I doing? What are my doubles doing? Which is really complicated.
Yeah, I think what we learn straight away from this film is that time travel is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even something as simple as, oh, I want to punch this guy in the face, and go back in time and then pretend like it never happened. That's, the paradox that you're creating there is just insurmountable. I mean, they touch on this in other films, but I think in this film especially, it's like they deal with that so much and they discuss it. They go into depth with it. And actually, what I wanted to let's start at the beginning of the film because
Mm-hmm.
we don't normally go through beat by beat, but I think with this movie,
It's important.
yeah, it's important. I think I want to talk about how. So when the movie begins, I love how it just throws you right into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts off with a little opening montage. They show you different details of the experiment going on inside the garage, which is where a lot of the action takes place, which is part of the genius of the low budget because, let's shoot it in a garage. Let's shoot it in a house in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yeah, so the movie starts. The movie begins there with the experiment going. It's the experiment's already happening. It's already going on. It's not the time travel experiment yet, but it's what becomes the time travel experiment. Like I said, I love how it just throws you right into that first conversation they have at the kitchen table, and there's something very refreshing about it. It immediately piques your interest and gets you intrigued for what's going on. These people are just they're just having this full-on technical, all this jargon's being thrown around, and you just like, there's no better way for this movie to get you into the next whatever. Well, it's not even 90 minutes, but the next 70 or so,
minutes.
70 or so
75
minutes, right? There's no better way, I think, than to just literally throw you into it, and that's what they do. And the other thing this film does, and it's illustrated so well in that first scene that it does so interestingly, I think, is it mixes the mundane with the fantastical. So obviously it's a story about time travel, it's a science fiction story, but at the same time, so as an example, so that first conversation that they're having at the dinner table, in the background, there's these domestic duties going on around them. I believe, is it his wife or his girlfriend? I forget who.
I
The main
believe
character.
that Aaron has a wife, Abe has a girlfriend.
Okay, so I think it's the wife, but
The wife,
either
yeah.
way, yeah. There's domestic things going on. There's dishes are being done. You can see Christmas decorations in the background in the corners of the frame, things like that. And then throughout the film, they're doing things like playing board games, tossing crumpled papers in the waste bins, like they're doing free throws. They're calling pest control about rats in the attic. There's a scene where they're just watching sports on TV.
Can I stop you though for a second with
Yeah,
the rats in the attic thing?
yeah.
In kind of reading up on this, I realized that there were never actually rats in the attic.
Okay.
I realized that if I know we're jumping a little bit, yeah, we'll
No,
come
no.
back to that. We'll come back to the
No,
rats in the attic. You can
that's
keep going.
actually something I wasn't aware of. But so things do have double meanings, obviously, in this
Mm-hmm.
film. But what I was just trying to illustrate there is just how they integrated the two aspects, because this is not a multi-million-dollar, this is not a high budget movie we're talking about here, and the way that they used these low budget locations and techniques, I think it just makes so much sense for this film, because these are two, not nobodies, but they're just young entrepreneurs that are just
Mm-hmm.
starting out. So obviously we're just going to be hanging out in living rooms and kitchens, and
Mm-hmm.
they play whatever, like, they're just watching sports, they go to a hotel. Nothing is extravagant about this movie, and I think that's what speaks to me about it, because it's almost like a down home version of a science fiction story. Did you get that from it?
Yeah, well, and I think what was nice about that, and there's a quote that was attributed to Shane Carruth. I'm trying to pull up the exact quote, if I can find it here. But basically, to paraphrase what he was saying is that a lot of humanity's great uh, discoveries have happened in much less glamorous environments
Yeah,
than this took place.
I
And
saw that.
the early prototypes of a lot of the great machines and other things that we've invented as human beings were really kind of primitive. So I loved that the actual time travel devices in this movie basically just look like boxes.
Yeah, okay.
Um, for two
Yeah, we could.
reasons. Yeah,
Mhm.
for two reasons. One is that they are a primitive technology in terms of their design, not in terms of what's going on inside them, but if you have these guys who don't have a high budget, which is kind of an interesting thing when you talk about the meta nature of the fact that this film is so micro budget also, and was pretty much just guys in their garage
Mhm.
inventing something that in the end ended up going way outside of their reach and probably their expectation, which is
But that is how
interesting.
it would start out in real life. That's the
Yeah,
thing. Like
it would
that,
start out like that. It would be
Yeah.
modest, and it would probably happen by mistake. They would be
Mhm.
trying to discover something else, and it would pop up.
Right.
Um, so I love that, and I think it made it feel a lot more realistic.
Mhm.
And also, it I think will prevent it. I mean, we're talking here 15 years after this film was made, and nothing about it seems dated or anything
I know.
because
That's another thing I realized when I watched it. Yeah.
yeah, which so often in sci-fi when you're dealing with something, you watch it even a few years later, and the way that the futuristic technology is portrayed feels so hokey and ridiculous. And in this
Yeah.
one, I have a feeling if time travel is ever invented, they'll probably look back at this film and be like, not bad. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like they kept it so modest that no one could even say anything about it. And actually, one of the quotes I read from the filmmaker, from Shane Carruth, when he was talking about the actual box that you were mentioning, the prototype, he said that prototypes almost never include neon lights and chrome.
Hmm.
I wanted to see a story play out that was more in line with the way real innovation takes place than I had seen on film before. And I think that when it comes down to it is the core of the film right there. Um, it's just it's just nuts and bolts. It's a movie that's only concerned with the meat and potatoes of inventing something. It actually reminds me a lot of Idaho Transfer because
Hmm.
a lot of the dialogue in that film um, is pretty procedural and just kind of discussing the plot, even though the plot is hard to really surmise. They're mostly talking about what's going on,
Yeah.
and in this film you get that a million times over, but it's kind of similar in that regard.
Interestingly, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Shane Carruth maybe watched Idaho Transfer in the making
Yeah,
of this because they did kind of take a very similar approach, and the science isn't.
more procedural. Yeah.
Yeah, the actual science isn't as important as
Hmm.
observing the characters interacting with what they've created,
Hmm.
um, and keeping it simple.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, and methodical. I think, like more than yeah. I think that because a lot of these films are just conversations because they're not concerned with showing big, they're not concerned with showing off with effects or anything like that.
Yeah,
So,
which there's no
uh,
point.
so what the film comes down to is dialogue, which in almost all these films, I would say that's actually been a pretty much a through line
Hmm.
for all the films we've talked about. When I think back on Liquid Sky, Dark Star, even THX. I mean, a lot of it is just dialogue based.
Hmm.
Just almost two characters or a bunch of people in a room just talking to each other about ideas and theories and things like that. Um, which, when it gets down to it, I mean, that's how you can probably cover the most ground with different ideas,
Hmm.
different science fiction ideas and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, but it does it. We go back to this classic filmmaker and writerly trope of the show don't tell, kind
Hmm.
of thing that you hear people say over and over again,
Hmm.
particularly in any kind of screenwriting seminar or book. Which
Oh
there's
yeah,
obviously debate on
it's
that as
it's been
to
drilled into my head.
yeah, everyone. Which and then you see some hotshot young writer director come along and it's all dialogue and you're like, what have I
Hmm.
been doing this whole time? But
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that this movie is a great example of two things. One is show don't tell, which is really interesting because there is so much dialogue, but the dialogue never really feels like they're actually telling you what's going on. It just feels like these kind of very
Well,
mundane conversations that
the
are
thing
important.
is, the thing is, they are,
Hmm.
but it's so abstract to you as the viewer
Yeah.
because you're not on the same level as them. Because one of the things that Shane Carruth when he set out to make this movie, he said he did not want to talk down to the audience. He wanted to, treat them as an equal in this field, because he actually had a degree. I was going to go into the background of him a little bit more, but he holds a BS in math from Stephen F. Austin State University, and he's a former engineer. So he does know what he's talking about. When he wrote the script for this, obviously he's a smart guy. So I think he just approached it with the idea that, you know what, we're just going to hit the ground running. The audience can catch up if they want. And this is very much a movie that if the viewer wants to get more into it and dive deeper into what they're talking about, they can.
Yeah. Because it's real. It's real. It's,
it's based on real theories, and, so it's, if they want to, it's all right there and if you go in the Wikipedia article, you'll see diagrams, and I'm sure there's probably thousands of sites out there dedicated to this movie, and theories and things like that. So it's fun. It's like it's almost like a puzzle, like it's a movie, but it's also, it feels like a kind of like a fun, well, it depends on how you look at it. It could be frustrating.
It could be.
When I first watched this movie, I guess I don't know if I was frustrated, but I didn't get it like I got it the second time.
Yeah. And I think that's okay. I think it's just one of those movies that demands a second watch, and I think we see less and less of those these days. For a couple, reasons. Markets is one reason. Also just popular taste. But I think, this is just one of those movies that if you only watch it once, you're not really going to ever connect with it, because it's just, there's so much information to absorb in such a short amount of time. But if you let yourself go in again, kind of not having to just figure out the basic layout of everything, but you kind of have a rough idea of where things go, and then you can really get into the ins and outs, it's very rewarding.
Yeah, and this brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, Jeremy. Do you think the filmmakers were particularly concerned with providing the viewers with a clear explanation of what is going on, or is that sort of missing the point of the film?
No, I think they were really concerned with making sure the viewer didn't really know what was going on, honestly, which is
you think
bold.
That wasn't... Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I know, because it feels too carefully constructed to me, that I think the filmmaker or filmmakers would be so blasé about, oh, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. Like I think that it was a conscious decision saying, and they could have saved it in a cut. I'm sure in an edit they could have figured out a way to construct it. They could have done a voiceover if they felt that, there are ways with a low budget where you can make things more clear. So clearly they watched this film back after they finished editing and said, no, this is this conscious decision. We want this to be confusing, at least the first time you watch it.
Yeah, and I think adding that narration in, like you were talking about, I think that also illustrates that, because if it was just straightforward with no narration, then that could be up for debate. But I think because they added that in,
they were conscious.
It creates like a sort of vagueness about it.
Yeah, because they very easily, with that narration, because the narration doesn't really pop up that often. You hear it maybe once every, I'm just guessing here, maybe once every 15, 20 minutes, if even. And they could have easily had that narration running through it like a Scorsese movie, where every scene has, we were doing this, and then we did that, and just clarifying. But I think for two reasons... That would have
kind of ruined it.
It would have been boring, because then it's basically just a story of two guys getting mad at each other because they're confused. And I think that... But what they did also with the narration, another reason why that wouldn't have worked, is that the narration, as I understand it, was a phone call. So I think that, to keep it a realistic phone call, it couldn't have run through. It was a phone call, I think, from Aaron to himself. I'm pretty sure. And that, once again, if you've seen the movie, that doesn't sound as confusing. If you haven't, then you're already so confused right now that it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
But I think it was a phone call from Aaron to one of his doubles explaining everything that had happened. So, Aaron isn't going to talk to himself as if he doesn't know anything. So it couldn't have just been this descriptive voiceover. He's not going to sit there and explain all the science and explain, he's going to explain the bare minimum of what his double needs to know to understand what he's trying to express. So yeah, I think it was a conscious decision that it's confusing, and I think that's a bold and exciting decision that it's confusing. It takes some real fearless writing and filmmaking to do that. It's
a unique way to present a narrative. It's an interesting approach. like I said, the dialogue is a huge part of it. It's mostly dialogue in the film, and it is almost completely procedural. But I found it funny, interesting that mixed in with this is bits of, well, like you said, the narration, and then things like, what do you want to eat? You know,
Yeah.
like where do you want to go to eat? Like, oh, it's a new place. Like it just kind of it makes it so much more like lived in and real when they do stuff like that, and
But
also
I-
adds. There's some humor as well,
Yeah.
mixed in. It's not, but I do love how completely serious they take it. And it's like you said, the characters themselves are never confused. Really, it's almost like it all falls on you, the viewer, to like, all right,
Sift through.
you gotta figure out what's going on with this, you know. So it's fun. Yeah, you just gotta like look at it with that approach, you know, when you come into it. You can't be intimidated by it.
Yeah.
You know.
What I will say with in regard to the, what do you want to eat kind of dialogue, or we'll get back to our rats in the attic here, is I don't think that dialogue is mixed in a way where it's just meant to lighten things. I think what it's kind of doing, because as they get further along, pretty much what they end up having to do is retrace their steps.
So it actually complicates things.
So it
Okay.
complicates things, because by having these what do you want to eat conversations, as a viewer, but also to put yourself in the shoes of these people, you realize that they can't gloss over those conversations either. Someone saying what do you want to eat becomes just as important as the science itself, because if they miss that what do you
no,
want
that's
to
a good
eat
point.
conversation, to get to the rats, the reason that is important, which
Let's get to the rats, Jeremy.
yeah,
Come
so
on,
the
let's
rats that I figured out by reading and looking at some analysis. I wish I had figured this out myself, because it's kind of a brilliant detail. Is that basically what happens at the end of the story? At a certain point, both Abe and Aaron realize that this is going horribly wrong and they need to fix it. So they've each created these fail-safe boxes, which pretty much allow them to go back to before any time travel has happened. And they would basically just need to take over, let the double go from there, and they would see their double and convince the double, don't do this, it's a bad idea, it's all going to go horribly wrong. But since they've both created these, but neither has knowledge that the other has done it or used it, Aaron starts recording conversations and everything that happens through the day, and he starts kind of reliving the same day over and over again to try to set it up to avoid this big, difficult confrontation that could go horribly wrong. So at one point, he actually ends up meeting one of his doubles because his plan goes wrong, and what he has to do is he has to lock his double up in the attic. But since this has been happening since before, because they're going back in time, the sound coming from the attic is actually just Aaron's double moving around trying to escape. So that's what's so crazy about this movie, is that these little tiny conversations that you gloss over because you're seeing it in the wrong order become really significant over time.
Wow.
There's things like when they're just eating breakfast, he goes back and he's putting some kind of drug in the cereal. So by seeing him eating the cereal on these first days, it's becoming important.
Right.
And things are what's also interesting about this movie, which this is why like the show don't tell thing can also be kind of it can be challenged in an interesting way, is a lot of the most important events in this entire film happen off screen.
Very true. Yeah.
And they're just discussed. So we are being told about them, but because they're just being discussed, then when we go back to them, it's even more kind of daunting and scary, because, or for example, there's one point when Abe's girlfriend's father, who they're trying to get to fund this project, they find out that he's been time traveling, and we have no clue how it's happened, and they have no clue how it's happened.
Because he has an unkempt beard or something.
Because he has an unkempt beard, yeah. And they saw him a few hours earlier, and he had a clean-shaven beard. So there's all these little
things like that.
Little tiny details that seem really insignificant, and it's just so tightly wound together. But because a lot of it's happening off-screen, it can be a little vague. But there's just so many of these amazing, complicated details that have been worked into this script that are just mind-blowing.
And like you said, even the mundane activities take up time. So in a film about time travel, everything is important. You're right. I mean, that's something I didn't even think of when I was thinking about that. But that's also why this movie can be watched multiple times, and why it is a good cult film, I think. Yeah.
I think in terms of like if we're going to talk about this from a filmmaker's perspective, a couple of the things
which I do want to do, because it's very interesting, the story behind it.
Yeah, well, the story behind it, but also just as Mark and I are both filmmakers, so just observing from the outside too. Like if I were making this film, the decisions that I maybe would have made differently. And I'm not going to start listing that because there's not a lot I would have done differently, because this isn't my film. But I'm saying just observationally what they were doing that I think is really interesting. They have like a couple concepts going on. One is kind of the traditional like Hitchcock version of suspense, where because we're seeing things out of order, we understand that there is this thing that has gone wrong, and we don't entirely understand exactly what it is. But because there's this, you know, bomb under the table, to use Hitchcock's phrasing, there's this thing that we understand is going to explode at some point. I think that makes us, even though we don't totally get it, we're kind of hooked. But another thing that I think is really great, which I heard an interview recently with Stanley Kubrick, which he didn't do a lot of interviews, so it was really cool. I found this little soundbite, which maybe we can include somewhere. But he's talking about efficiency in filmmaking and how he thinks that commercials are so efficient, and how most directors in feature films have to kind of take too much time to explain things. And he's saying that, the greatest, when cinema will separate itself from literature, will be when it's kind of this purely visual thing, when it's efficient, when you don't need to take time to explain things, when you can just show an image and it comes across. And I think that the fact that in 77 minutes, including credits, that they were able to pack this much information is just unbelievable.
And part of that is due to the fact that I believe it was the shooting ratio was 2-1, which is unheard of on a feature film. So let's dive into the actual making of this film just a little bit, because I think it's very important to talk about, especially with this movie. So the budget for the entire film, like we said, was around $7,000. Most of that money was spent on 16 millimeter film stock, which was then transferred to mini digital video film, so it could be edited on a PC. So in terms of major productions, that is almost nothing.
Nothing, yeah. I know short films that are made for 3 times that.
Exactly. So in order to cut costs, Shane Carruth, the filmmaker, he wore many hats. He was the writer, he acted in it, he did the editing, I believe he did the music as well. And he did mostly single takes of the shots, and and like we said, there was that shooting ratio of 2-1, so they only filmed what they needed. They had everything very heavily storyboarded and thought out well beforehand, which actually goes into play with how the movie comes across as well. So it's kind of interesting, how everything is kind of straightforward and just kind of like laying it all out there for you. So then, he transferred it to mini digital video, so he could edit it on his own computer. Obviously, this caused some problems. There were some sound issues and other post-production issues. I think the editing of it actually took a couple years because of that. So the actual filming took place a very short span of time. I think it was like a month, probably like a month or something like that. And then, but the post-production was much longer. And then, there was a lack of footage, which made it difficult to work around for certain continuity errors and things like that. So the reason that we don't see a lot of things, partly, I'm sure, in the film itself, I'm sure that's partly due to that. But also, I think they were very smart about it. And I think from a story standpoint, it makes sense, the things that we don't see. There's a reason we don't see it, like you said. I mean, I think it all comes back around, and it's a movie that you could watch multiple times and just get something new from it every time. So I just found it very interesting with, how he was a very smart guy. He incorporated his background in schooling and being an engineer. He incorporated everything that he had into, he got his friends together, friends and family, and he just made this movie, and it's very inspiring. I mean, for us, both of us being filmmakers, I think looking at that, we're like, damn, what the hell am I doing?
It kind of harkens back to like the Robert Rodriguez, El Mariachi,
totally.
early 90s Sundance generation, which this film won I believe the Grand Jury Prize. Yeah, Grand Jury Prize at Sundance. So that's a major, I mean, obviously 2004, these days Sundance means something a little bit different because, back in the kind of 90s, early 2000s Sundance days, you saw a lot more of this kind of thing. These days, Sundance is a lot more, it's generally a little bit bigger budget now, but it's still a huge deal for a film made for this small of a budget without any famous actors or actresses. Really no one of note attached to it to take home that prize. Yeah.
It went on to make almost 425,000 at the box office. So.
And I'm sure now after, this was on Netflix, So,
Oh,
this little thing, not that the money is the most important thing, but the fact
but
that,
for this being your first film, and I mean, yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what he did. Not by himself, obviously, but he did a big brunt of it was him.
Mhm.
And he did go on to make not too much else. We talked about this a little bit. He did direct he did direct Upstream Color, which I did see and I liked. And now that I'm trying to think of it, I can't remember anything about it, but I remember liking it. But if I liked Primer this much after revisiting it, I wonder if I should revisit that one as well. And it's definitely a much more vague movie, but in a good way.
yeah.
Yeah, just to dive one last little bit into the well of budget talk. There was a creative use of objects and supplies. Much of it was analog, which I thought was cool. Like you're talking about like the box itself for the prototype and stuff. That was, I thought, really cool. Just a plain gray box, just had like a hum sound overlay.
A
It's like
little bit of shaking.
very, very basic. Yeah, a little shaking going on. I think it was, I looked it up. They overlaid sounds of mechanical grinder and a car engine. So no digital effects there. This is all just nuts and bolts. And like you said, it was set in unglamorous industrial parks, suburban tract homes, things like that. So there's all different angles. They cut the corners. It's just But also, I think it's interesting, like the way they used 16 millimeter stock and they transferred that to mini digital. It's interesting because it kind of gives it this grainy look that I like, actually. You only see it on certain movies from a certain time frame, I would say, where you actually still see that kind of grain. And it's from the film, but also being processed onto the digital.
Yeah, it's kind of
Which
tortured.
yeah, and it gives it, I'm sure a lot of people don't like that look, but I think it can be kind of unique and has kind of like a warm feel to it. Literally like a fuzzy feel to it, which it just makes it a little different because so many movies now are so cold and sterile looking that it just gives it a little extra character. I think certain types of movies, and it works better for some than others, for sure.
Well, and the photography of this is really pretty
Yeah,
stellar.
I wanted to talk about that too, because even though it's so dialogue based, they switch up the scenery a lot. They do a good job of switching up the scenery and having it set in different locations, and also the way they frame certain shots, and they'll cut off certain things here. Like the framing is just always interesting of what they're doing. But what did you notice?
Well, I just
Particularly?
in terms of obviously, so what I'm noticing and just thinking about now actually is that it's hitting me is I didn't even really question how well photographed this was. When I was watching, I was just kind of in the story. But if they're only shooting on a 2-to-1 ratio, that means that not only is the photograph, not only are the images framed that beautifully to begin with, but that means that they're getting those performances, because the performances in this movie are really good as well. Like I
Yeah,
didn't question it for a second. And
for
so then,
non-actors, for
yeah,
sure.
for
Yeah.
non-actors, and they really beautifully framed up. And that this is all happening in 2 takes is pretty remarkable because I
Right.
know I've been on sets, and even if you're working with really good actors, something will happen with a focus pull,
Hmm.
that makes it go, like, there's so many things that can go wrong, which
So
is
many things that can go
why
wrong.
movies, and this wasn't shot, if you're shooting this on digital, it doesn't matter. If you're shooting
Hmm.
it on digital, you can shoot a million takes,
Oh
and
yeah.
you're just
Yeah.
get it, you just clear your memory card out, and then you're good, you just keep
Hmm.
going. But the fact that they shot this on film and were able to get performances that were that on point, in
Yeah.
combination with how well lit it was, is
Hmm.
really astounding.
It's interesting that you bring that up because if this movie was made today, it would probably be made strictly digital,
Yeah, for
right?
sure, 100%.
And they'd have tons and tons of footage probably, unless they set out to be like we're only gonna film what we storyboard,
Which is an
which
interesting challenge, of course.
yeah, and I mean people try to make films that way, and I'm sure many people do, but at the end of the day, it's like we have a digital camera, let's just shoot,
Yeah,
let's
we have
let's
the
get some
time. Let's get an extra
let's
shot.
yeah let's get some b-roll, let's get an extra take of this shot, so it's like a little bit here, a little bit there, and you end up almost kind of completely changing what you set out to do. So I think it's interesting that this was made in 2004, like the time it was made, it's they they were using film. That's what they were happened to be using, and that's what they wanted to use. And because of that, I think that caused a lot of decisions for them because of the small budget that they had. And I think it just makes me wonder like how much of this film comes from that. It's like you talk about being a low budget. I mean, how much of this film is what it is because of its budget?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we may lose some of that without with film going away.
Mm-hmm.
Not even for the worse or for the better.
It's just a change.
It's just going to be different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you people can make a movie on an iPhone these days.
Exactly.
Which is great. I think it's really exciting, but it also, I think it makes it a lot more experimental.
You're not being, but also you're not being as discerning about what you're putting out there, I think.
Well, and a really good filmmaker will be, but I also think in the spirit of experimentation, it's kind of a weird trade-off, because what's experimental here happened in pre-production. Whereas if you're shooting on an iPhone, what's experimental, you might say, oh, well, I'm going to experiment with, like, I know for me, like, I do this series of short films, and I make them, each film I do for $5. It's called $5 Shorts. I just, every other week.
You can plug it, Jeremy.
I'll plug it a little. We'll put a link to that too. But what I know is that because I'm shooting digitally, I'll kind of pick an exercise to focus on with each film I'm doing, and sometimes that exercise will be, improvisation. Sometimes it'll be a challenging camera movement that I don't know if I can pull off, or it might look weird, or a weird way of cutting it together, which means I have to shoot it in a weird way.
You push yourself in certain ways.
I'll push myself, but a lot of that is happening on the day, on set, working with actors, working with the camera. It's kind of breaking down because, generally the way it'll go is you're writing a script. If you're doing a feature film or even a bigger short film, you're writing a script and you're doing a lot of pre-production. You're trying to get it pretty locked down. So when you actually get on set, you don't have to worry about as much problem solving. So my goal with these is I've always kind of been like, well, I'm going to open myself up to on-set problem solving. What's interesting is someone working in such a small budget range, 15 years ago, they kind of have to say, we're not going to deal with any on-set problem solving. Like, all of our problems need to happen beforehand, because if we waste our film, then there'll just be a hole in the movie.
Which is a very Hitchcock way to do it, because that was his philosophy. It's, everything's been worked out before the camera even rolls. So, but then, that takes away something from the filmmaking. I think Hitchcock even said that filmmaking became boring for him because
he knew what he was.
Well, after that stage of the script being written and everything being meticulously planned out, he found it boring. So there is something to be said for just getting in there, getting on set, on location of that day, and just trying things out, just experimenting. I think that's really cool that you do that, Jeremy. And people should check out those $5 shorts. You can plug it. Where is it? Where can we find it at?
So it's a couple places. So if you go on, which this is weird because I don't normally.
No, do it, man.
But
I fully endorse it. Yeah.
No, well, if you endorse it, Mark, I'll go for it. You can check it out. It's on Facebook, and it's $5 shorts. That's $5.00. So like, as if you were writing on a check, $5, and then the word shorts. Or you can see it on my Vimeo channel, which is Vimeo/Remy Fink. So check it out.
I think it goes right along with what we're talking about here, to be honest, because it doesn't get much less than $5, right? Now is it actually $5 or?
Well, so it is. It is not counting the equipment I already own. So I own a DSLR camera. And I own a little lavalier microphone, which I'm recording on now, and that, and I own a couple of work lights, like the ones you would see construction workers working with. Depot, no, like professional lighting equipment. So the
other than that,
so the $5 will go to a prop. I mean, most of them honestly end up being $0, because you just get so used to writing without the budget.
Or you use things that you already have, like you said,
Which to go back to Primer, I think is a lot of what they're doing. They're like, oh, well, we're engineers, so we know people who work at this lab, so we can film a scene in the lab. We have some sheets of metal already probably lying around because they're, he's an engineer and he has friends who are engineers, so they were probably already actually just doing some kind of project with this.
Probably, yeah.
So we have this laying around, which is a really exciting way of making films, and I think it also inspires some kind of creativity, because I think if we were to see Michael Bay go and try to make Primer, and this isn't to knock on Michael Bay, but
I'd love to see that.
I would love to see that too, actually. But I think that the means, I think the means of the time travel and the spaces that they were building in would probably look a lot more like an Avengers headquarters than a garage. So I think that this is one of those situations, as we talked about a lot in this series. One of the biggest themes is kind of that the limitation breeds the creativity. And because it just had to be so controlled, it really opened things up, because you have to figure out how do we, even blocking, how do we block this scene out in a garage instead of this massive lab space, and those kind of little things, or how do we show something moving without actually having a special effect to move it around.
Right.
And it's those little things that I think make it really rich, that directors who do work on bigger budgets, who are really good, kind of still take that attitude. I think if you see, a Paul Thomas Anderson or a Sofia Coppola, or a Barry Jenkins, like those are directors who are still kind of taking that same attitude, like, what's the most creative way to do this, not the most expensive, not the most flashy.
Yeah.
But it does become really easy once you start getting a little money and more forces behind what you're working on. It can become really easy to forget that this is an amazing way to do it.
Ingenuity is what it all comes down to.
Yes.
That's, I think, the main through line for these films. But since this is the last film in this series, Jeremy, was there anything you wanted to say in regards to that? Anything to sum it up, or anything that or how do you think this film Primer? How do you think it fits in with everything else here?
So personally, this was one of the films that I enjoyed the most from this series. Maybe I would say Liquid Sky is the other one that really clicks for me.
That was a highlight.
Yeah, and I think that the reason that these two films kind of stood out for me more than any others, and I enjoyed going through this entire series, as I do through every series.
Same.
I love watching any movie. But the reason that these two in particular stood out to me is that they were human stories. And I think a lot of these, most of the films we've talked about were pretty human, but these two in particular, they kind of use the science to get to something more philosophical,
yes,
or more emotional, which for me is what a great sci-fi movie or book does. It uses the science to talk about human problems, as we discussed last time with Idaho Transfers, that ultimately that's the goal. So I think Primer is a great way to end it. And I would definitely, if you haven't seen this movie, even if you're not into sci-fi at all, even if you hate sci-fi, but you are curious about low-budget filmmaking, just watch this movie just to see how they did it.
Yeah, it's an indie movie from 2004. It's so even if you just look at it like that, it's like, okay, just it takes you on a ride, and it's definitely worth watching more than once. I would say that as well.
What about you, Mark? Any final thoughts on this movie or the series as a whole?
I would say you kind of summed it up. What I was thinking actually was just about, when you don't have the money to make Aliens or Star Wars or anything like that, what you rely on is ideas and characters. You rely on people and concepts and things like that. So it's more abstract, but I think it's very satisfying. And I think I agree with you. I think all these films were very satisfying to watch in one way or another. And they were all certainly worth it, worth either visiting for the first time or revisiting. And I encourage anyone who did listen to the series and didn't watch all these movies, I would encourage watching all of them, because there is some sort of a strange through line through all of it, even more than we let on when we started this, I think.
Yeah, well, more than we even knew,
More than we even knew, exactly, yeah. And partly due to the ingenuity that we talked about as well. Just to see how they solve these little problems is very interesting. And it's different. Not something you go to the movie theater every day and you could see that on screen. So something to go back and look at, even if you're not a fan of sci-fi, like you said, even if you're just a lover of film, I think it's something cool to check out.
100%.
So I think that's going to do it for us. That was probably a long one, but I don't know how else to talk about that movie without kind of babbling on about it, because it's one of those movies, man.
It just is.
It's like I said, if you want to get into it more, you can. Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of things online you can find to get into this one. But that's gonna do it for us. Anything else you wanted to add here at the end?
No, just thanks for listening to this series, and looking forward to moving to our next one.
Yeah, we're gonna figure out another one here. We got a lot to choose from, so we just have to narrow it down. But for now, thank you for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean. and hopefully soon Spotify. Still trying to figure that one out. As well as on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.